the heart of New York City, where the skyscrapers touch the sky and the streets never sleep, a chance encounter is about to change the course of two lives forever. Ethan Walker, a self-made tech mogul, has everything most people dream of: wealth, fame, and success. But behind the polished facade, there's an emptiness that lingers, a nagging feeling that his accomplishments mean nothing if they don't lead to something more meaningful. And then, there's Grace Miller, a woman the world has forgotten. Once a bright teacher with dreams of making a difference, she now sits on the cold streets, invisible to most, wrapped in the bitter reality of homelessness. Her life has been reduced to survival, with no hope of reclaiming the future she lost. What happens when a millionaire's world collides with a beggar's fate? When a simple decision to help someone in need spirals into something that neither of them could have foreseen? This is a story of redemption, trust, and the unlikely bonds that can change everything. But as their paths intertwine, both Ethan and Grace will have to face the past, the judgments of others, and their own inner demons. What they'll discover along the way will shake them to their core. The streets of New York City were alive with energy, even in the biting cold of early December. The sharp winds swirled between the towering buildings, the relentless pace of the city refusing to slow down. Ethan Walker, sitting comfortably in the back of his black sedan, watched the world pass by as his driver navigated the crowded streets of the financial district. It had been another long day of meetings and negotiations, the weight of running a billion-dollar tech company always heavy on his shoulders. The luxury of the city was everywhere, from the gleaming office towers to the expensive boutiques lining the sidewalks. Yet, despite all the wealth around him, something gnawed at Ethan's mind. The emptiness, the nagging feeling that no matter how much he accomplished, he was still missing something. The car slowed as it approached a red light at a busy intersection. Ethan's eyes wandered across the street, watching the blur of people bundled up in winter coats, rushing to their destinations. The sound of heels clicking against the pavement, the distant hum of traffic, and the ever-present city noise filled the air. But then, something unusual caught his attention. There, sitting against the wall of an old building, was a woman. Her appearance was striking in its contrast to the fast-paced world around her. She was young, maybe in her late 20s, but there was a weight in her posture that made her seem older, worn down by life. She was wrapped in a thin, faded blanket, her arms crossed tightly around herself, as though to fend off the biting cold. Her tangled hair covered part of her face, but Ethan could still see the hollow, distant look in her eyes as she stared blankly at the ground. She wasn't asking for anything, no sign, no hand extended for charity. She simply sat there, seemingly invisible to the busy world around her, her eyes empty, yet observant. Ethan turned his gaze away for a moment, his mind returning to the demands of his day. But something made him glance back. The image of the woman lingered in his mind, pulling at him. She looked so out of place, so young, and yet so lost. His fingers tightened on the armrest as the light turned green. But as his car began to move, Ethan felt an unexpected pull. Something about her presence seemed to call out to him. He didn't know why, but the need to understand why this woman, so young and seemingly discarded, was sitting there began to take over. The car glided through the intersection, and before long, the street corner was behind him. But that image of her, her quiet sadness, stayed with him. Later that evening, as Ethan sat at a lavish dinner party with colleagues and investors, his mind kept drifting back to the woman on the street corner. He tried to focus on the conversation, on the champagne being passed around, but the thought of her, cold, alone, kept pulling at him. Why was she there? What was her story? Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the laughter and clinking of glasses fading into the background. His thoughts wandered again, and his mind kept returning to that cold street corner. She had haunted him. The thought that someone so young could be left to face the harsh world alone gnawed at him in a way he couldn't ignore. That night, as he lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Grace from his mind. He didn't know why, but he couldn't just let it go. The next morning, as the sun barely rose over the skyline, Ethan made a decision that seemed illogical, even to him. He instructed his driver to take him to the same street corner he had passed the night before. He had to understand. Ethan's car came to a smooth stop at the same intersection, the familiar red light signaling his arrival. His mind was not on the work ahead or the day's meetings. His thoughts were entirely consumed by the woman he had seen yesterday. The same street corner, the same cold wind biting at the exposed skin of passers-by. But this time, Ethan was determined to act. He wasn't sure why he was here, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to do something. He had to understand who she was, what had happened to her, and whether he could help. The driver, a seasoned man named Tom, glanced over his shoulder with a slight raise of the eyebrows. "Back again, sir?" Ethan nodded absently, his gaze locked on the sidewalk ahead. He wasn't in the mood for small talk, and Tom, having driven him for years, knew better than to press. Ethan's focus never wavered as he stepped out of the car, the chill of the December air biting at his face, reminding him of the disconnect between his insulated life and the cold reality some people face daily. As he walked towards the corner, he noticed that the usual bustle of the financial district was still in full force. Pedestrians in business suits rushed by, their breath clouding in the frosty air, their faces hard and focused, oblivious to the world around them. But his eyes were drawn to the same figure, the young woman, Grace, still sitting in the same spot. The blanket was the same faded gray, wrapped tightly around her frame. But now, there was something different in her eyes. She wasn't just staring at the ground as before. Her gaze shifted slightly, locking with his for a brief moment. It was as if she had been waiting for him. Ethan's heart raced for reasons he didn't fully understand. He felt a twinge of discomfort, a sense of guilt, for being one of the many who passed by her every day, without giving her a second thought. Today was different. He had already decided. Today, he would break through that barrier. He approached slowly, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the sidewalk. Grace didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on him, no longer the indifferent, distant gaze from before, but something sharper, more guarded, as if she were silently measuring him, questioning his motives. Ethan stopped just a few feet away from her, unsure of how to proceed. "What do you want?" Grace's voice was firm, but there was a slight tremor, as though the chill of the morning had seeped into her very bones. Ethan blinked. He had expected some resistance, but not this direct confrontation. He had no rehearsed lines, no grand speeches about saving the world or helping the less fortunate. All he had was his instinct, which felt increasingly unreliable the closer he got to her. "I saw you here yesterday," Ethan began, his voice tentative. "Are you okay?" Grace didn't respond immediately. Instead, she lifted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, almost defiant edge. "I'm sitting on the street corner wrapped in a blanket. What do you think?" Her tone was not hostile, but there was a bite to it, an honesty that cut through the air between them. Ethan felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. He had to break through this wall somehow. "I just wanted to see if you needed anything," he said softly, trying to soften the edges of the awkwardness between them. Grace let out a short, humorless laugh. "I need a lot of things, But you can't give me any of them. Her gaze returned to the ground, avoiding him now. Ethan's chest tightened. There was so much about this encounter that felt wrong, yet there was also something deeply compelling. She didn't ask for charity, didn't beg for his help. She didn't fit the mold he was accustomed to, the mold of people who approached him with ulterior motives, asking for money or favors. "Maybe I can help," he said, surprising even himself with the certainty in his voice. She glanced at him again, a flicker of suspicion crossing her features. "Help? Help with what?" "Help with whatever you need," Ethan replied, his words feeling inadequate, even as they left his lips. What could he offer? What could someone like him possibly do for someone like her? But the impulse was stronger than logic. Grace didn't respond immediately. Instead, she pulled her knees up closer to her chest, wrapping her arms tighter around herself. Ethan watched her for a moment, wondering if he was simply wasting her time, or if there was a chance, just a small chance, that he could offer something that might make a difference. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. She hesitated, the silence stretching out between them before she finally spoke. "Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Grace," Ethan repeated, as though savoring the name. "I'm Ethan." Grace didn't reply, her eyes focused once again on the ground. There was something about the way she held herself, so detached, so unwilling to be part of the world around her, that struck him deeply. He stood there for a few moments, feeling the weight of the cold settling in, both physically and emotionally. He wasn't sure how to move forward. What could he offer? What could someone like him possibly give a woman like her? "I'll come back tomorrow," Ethan said, before he even thought about it. He wasn't sure why he said it, but it felt right. It felt like something he needed to do, something he couldn't walk away from. Not this time. Grace's response was quieter than he expected. "You don't need to come back." Her words were gentle, almost resigned, but they struck him with the force of a command. Ethan opened his mouth to say something more, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the distance between them, a chasm that was more than just the physical space. He didn't belong in her world, and she had no place in his. But there was a connection here, something unspoken, something that drew him in and wouldn't let go. He turned, walking back to his car, his thoughts racing. As he drove away, he realized something profound. It wasn't about helping her in the way he had imagined. It wasn't about solving her problems or offering a quick fix. It was about understanding her, seeing her for who she was, and maybe, just maybe, giving her the one thing she hadn't asked for: respect. Later that night, as Ethan lay awake in his apartment, the city lights casting shadows on his walls, he couldn't stop thinking about Grace. Something had shifted in him. He had spent so many years building his empire, gaining wealth, and yet none of it had ever made him feel the way he did now. He had to see her again. He didn't know why, but he knew he couldn't leave her on that street corner, not after what he had seen in her eyes. Ethan could hardly concentrate as the days passed. The image of Grace, sitting so still on the corner of that busy intersection, seemed to hover in his mind, demanding his attention. He found himself distracted during meetings, his thoughts constantly drifting back to her, wondering what she was doing, why she hadn't asked for help, and why she hadn't simply disappeared into the anonymity of the crowd, like so many others. The first time he had seen her, he had felt nothing. But now, there was a nagging curiosity that refused to go away. He had to know more. Every morning, Ethan's routine had become automatic, mechanical. Wake up, coffee, car, office. But now each of those steps felt distant, as though he was walking through life in a fog. His success, his business, even the accolades that had come from building a multi-million-dollar company. It all seemed insignificant when measured against what he was beginning to feel about Grace. But Grace was not an easy person to help. Her pride, her silence, and the walls she had built around herself made it nearly impossible to get through. Even as he offered her the simplest of gestures, food, shelter, a conversation, she remained unyielding, like a fortress he couldn't breach. The next day, Ethan found himself back at that corner, just as he had promised. The usual buzz of the city was as chaotic as ever, but this time, something felt different. He wasn't here on business. He wasn't here to fix anything. He was just here to be with Grace. As he approached, he noticed her immediately. Grace was sitting on the ground, wrapped in the same blanket, though this time it was pulled tighter around her. She didn't look up as Ethan came closer, but her posture, so rigid, so defiant, spoke volumes. She was waiting, perhaps for him to give up and walk away. Ethan stopped a few feet from her. "Grace," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Her eyes flicked up briefly, but she didn't answer. Her expression was guarded, unreadable, but there was something different in her gaze. He couldn't quite place it, but it wasn't the hostility he had seen the first time. "I brought you something," Ethan continued, his voice steady but unsure. He reached into the bag he was carrying and pulled out a warm sandwich and a bottle of water. He set it gently on the ground beside her. "I thought you might be hungry." Grace's eyes flickered toward the sandwich, then back to him. She didn't take it. Instead, she sighed, almost imperceptibly, and finally spoke. "I don't need you to feel sorry for me, Ethan." "I'm not feeling sorry for you," Ethan replied, his tone more confident now. "I just thought you might appreciate it." There was a long silence, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Grace sat with her arms wrapped tightly around her, her expression unreadable, while Ethan stood, waiting. The cold air wrapped around them, but the tension between them seemed even thicker than the winter chill. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Grace shifted slightly, her hand moving toward the sandwich, but she didn't pick it up. Instead, she looked up at him, her eyes sharp with suspicion. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice was low, but there was an intensity to it that made Ethan's stomach tighten. Ethan paused, the question catching him off guard. He had never stopped to truly examine why he kept coming back. He had never really thought about it beyond his initial impulse to help. "I'm not sure," he said honestly, his voice soft. I can't stop thinking about you, about how you ended up here." He met her gaze, and for the first time, he felt the weight of her eyes, the challenge in them, the walls she had built. "I want to understand. I want to help." Grace didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let out a short, bitter laugh. "You don't understand. You can't. You don't know what it's like to be here, to be nothing." Ethan's heart sank at her words, but he couldn't back down. "I might not know what it's like to be on the streets, but I know what it's like to feel lost," he said quietly. "I know what it's like to have everything and still feel like something's missing." For a moment, there was silence between them. Then, to his surprise, Grace looked down at the sandwich, and without a word, she picked it up. She didn't eat it right away, though. Instead, she studied it, as if it were some sort of puzzle she didn't quite understand. Ethan watched her, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. There was no rush. He wasn't expecting anything from her. He was just here, present. And that, in itself, felt like a small victory. Finally, she broke the silence. "I used to be a teacher," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I had a life, a future, but it all fell apart." She paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. I lost my job when the school closed. My family disappeared after that. One by one, they turned their backs on me. And then I ended up here." Ethan's heart ached as he listened to her story. It wasn't just the loss of a job or the loss of a home. Grace had lost everything she had ever known, everything that had once defined her. And now, here she was, sitting on the streets, fighting just to survive. "You don't deserve this," Ethan said softly, his voice breaking through the quiet between them. Grace's eyes flicked to him, and for the first time, there was a crack in her armor. "No one deserves this, Ethan," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "But that doesn't change the fact that it's my reality now. It's all I have left." Ethan stood there, silent for a long moment, processing her words. There was no easy answer, no simple solution. He couldn't take away her pain. He couldn't fix her life with a single act of kindness. But maybe, just maybe, he could help her see that she wasn't alone. "I'm not going to ask you to trust me," Ethan said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "But I'll be here. I'll come back tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to share your story. But I'm not leaving until I know you're okay." Grace stared at him for a long time, her face unreadable. Then, with a soft exhale, she nodded. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As Ethan turned to leave, he felt something in his chest loosen, a small but significant shift. It wasn't a breakthrough, not yet, but it was progress. And that was enough for now. The days following his visit to Grace on the street were uneventful, and yet Ethan found himself thinking about her constantly. His days were filled with meetings, conference calls, and endless streams of emails. But at the back of his mind, there was always the image of Grace, her weary eyes, the way she wrapped herself tightly in that thin blanket, as if trying to protect herself from a world that had long forgotten her. He couldn't get her out of his mind, and for the first time in a long while, his success felt hollow in comparison to the growing sense of responsibility he felt for her. He had promised he would come back, and he had. But with each passing day, he noticed the distance between them. Grace had been polite, but distant, accepting his food without much gratitude, listening to his attempts at conversation without giving much in return. She had built a wall around herself, one that Ethan knew wouldn't be easy to break down. And yet, he persisted, driven by something he couldn't explain. But that afternoon, when he sat in his office, preparing for yet another round of high-stakes meetings, he received a call that would change everything. The phone rang, breaking the silence in his sleek, modern office. Ethan glanced at the caller ID, and for a moment, he thought he had misread it. The number was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that struck him as important. His heart skipped a beat when he saw that it was an unknown number from a payphone, a far cry from the corporate calls he usually received. He picked up the phone, his voice steady despite the nervous fluttering in his chest. "Hello?" There was a long pause on the other end, and then a voice, faint and shaky, came through the line. "Ethan, it's Grace." He froze. "Grace?" He leaned forward in his chair, his mind racing. "Are you okay?" I don't know what to do anymore." Her voice trembled, the words barely audible through the static of the payphone. "I'm cold, and I can't stop shaking. Please, can you help me?" Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. She was scared. She was calling him, not asking for money or charity, but for something much more personal, something that he could give her, something real. "I'm on my way," he said without hesitation, his words sharp, urgent. "Where are you?" Grace gave him the location, her voice weak and distant. It sounded like she was struggling to hold herself together. Ethan didn't wait another second. He hung up the phone and grabbed his jacket, quickly making his way out of the office. His assistant, Maya, looked up as he passed her desk, her expression concerned. "Mr. Walker, everything all right?" Maya asked, her eyes scanning his rushed movements. "I'll be back soon. Hold my calls," he replied tersely, not wanting to explain more. Maya knew better than to press him. She had witnessed his moods and could sense when he was determined to handle something on his own. The drive to the corner where Grace had been the day before felt like an eternity. Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, all of them revolving around Grace. What had happened to her since their last meeting? What had driven her to reach out? Why now? He couldn't shake the worry that something terrible had happened to her, that she had been pushed too far, too fast. When he finally arrived, the street corner was as busy as ever. People rushed past him, lost in their own worlds, unaware of the urgency of his mission. He scanned the crowd, his heart beating faster with each passing second, until finally he saw her. Grace was sitting on the curb, her back hunched, her face pale and gaunt. She was shivering uncontrollably, her arms wrapped tightly around her body. Her clothes were threadbare, and the thin blanket she had been wearing was barely enough to shield her from the cold. Her eyes, though heavy with exhaustion, flickered when they met his, but she didn't move. She seemed too weak to respond to his approach. Ethan rushed toward her, dropping to his knees beside her. "Grace, what happened? Why didn't you call me earlier?" "I didn't know who else to turn to," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't keep going. I didn't know what to do. I'm scared." His heart broke at the sight of her, vulnerable and broken in a way he hadn't seen before. He reached out to gently touch her arm, his voice soothing but filled with urgency. "Grace, you don't have to do this alone. You called me for help, and I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. Just breathe. We're going to get you somewhere safe." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with something that resembled fear and a flicker of hope. It was the first time she had allowed herself to be this open with him, and it scared her just as much as it encouraged her. She wanted to trust him, but after all she had been through, trusting anyone felt like a dangerous gamble. "Please, Grace," Ethan urged, standing and gently lifting her to her feet. "You don't have to stay here. I have a place for you to stay, a real bed and food. Let me help you." "I don't want to be a burden," she said, her voice thick with shame. "You're not a burden," Ethan said firmly, locking eyes with her. "You don't have to be ashamed. I'm here because I want to be. Please, let me help." For a moment, Grace hesitated. Her mind raced with doubt, her pride keeping her rooted to the street. But then she looked into Ethan's eyes and saw only sincerity, no pity, no judgment. He wasn't trying to save her for the sake of feeling good about himself. He genuinely wanted to help. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered, barely audible. "Okay, I'll go with you." Ethan helped her into his car, wrapping her in a thick coat he had grabbed from the trunk. As they drove, the tension between them remained, but it was no longer the cold, insurmountable wall it had been before. This time, there was a tentative trust between them, fragile, but real. The drive to the guest house was quiet. Grace sat beside him, her body trembling not just from the cold, but from the emotional weight of everything she had just shared. Ethan drove in silence, giving her space, but his mind was spinning. He couldn't let her go back to the street. He couldn't let her slip through his fingers. When they arrived, Ethan led Grace into the guest house, a quiet little apartment he had kept for situations just like this. He had it stocked with the basics: food, water, blankets, nothing fancy, but everything she needed to recover. Ethan handed her the key and smiled. You can stay here as long as you need. Grace hesitated, but then accepted the key. She looked up at him, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say. Thank you. You don't have to say anything, Ethan replied. You just need to take care of yourself. Get some rest. And as he turned to leave, he couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. Grace was safe, for now, and he would do everything in his power to keep it that way. The guest house was a far cry from the pristine luxury of Ethan's penthouse, but it had something that his mansion didn't: the warmth of a real home. It was tucked away in a quiet part of the city, away from the prying eyes and constant noise that filled the heart of Manhattan. The apartment was small, with soft, muted colors and wooden floors that creaked when you walked across them, giving it an air of humble comfort. Ethan had purchased the place years ago, never really using it, but now it felt like the perfect sanctuary for Grace to heal, to regain control over her life. As Ethan watched her step inside, her face still pale from the ordeal, a pang of guilt gnawed at him. He had offered her a place to stay, but he knew that offering her safety wasn't enough. The real work, the healing, had yet to begin. Here, Ethan said, his voice low, as he handed her a soft, thick blanket. You can stay here as long as you need to. It's not much, but it's yours. Grace glanced around, her eyes taking in the simple furnishings: a small couch, a bed with fresh linens, a desk in the corner with a few books stacked neatly on top. It was clear that this place wasn't meant for luxury. It was meant for solace, a safe haven from the cold reality she had been living in. She sat down on the couch slowly, her hands still shaking from the cold, but her eyes, for the first time since Ethan had met her, seemed less guarded. The layers of defense she had carefully built up over the years were still there, but they were beginning to crack. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Ethan watched her for a moment before speaking. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, he said gently, sitting across from her. I'm not here to push you, but I want you to know you're not alone. I'll be here if you need anything. Grace didn't respond right away. She just stared at the floor, lost in her thoughts. Ethan knew the weight of her silence, the internal battles she was fighting, battles that ran deeper than what he could ever fully understand. After a long moment, she looked up at him, her expression still heavy with uncertainty. Why are you doing this? Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. You're right. I don't know you, but I know what it's like to feel like you're invisible, to feel like the world doesn't care. And I don't think you deserve that. Grace's eyes flickered with something that almost resembled hope, but it was quickly masked by a veil of skepticism. And what happens when I fail you? What happens when you get tired of trying? Ethan shook his head. I'm not going anywhere. You don't have to be perfect, Grace. You just have to be you. For a moment, there was a quiet understanding between them, a brief connection that neither of them had expected. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something, a spark of trust, fragile but real. Ethan continued his daily routine, but his thoughts were never far from Grace. He called her each day, sometimes just to check in, sometimes to offer a little encouragement. The guest house had become a place of quiet recovery for Grace, and Ethan found himself feeling more and more invested in her journey, not just out of obligation, but out of something deeper, something he couldn't quite place. He wasn't just providing her with shelter. He was helping her rebuild a sense of dignity, a sense of purpose. Grace was hesitant at first. She didn't know how to trust someone who had so much, while she had so little. She didn't know how to accept kindness without feeling guilty for taking it. But with each passing day, she began to let down her guard, bit by bit. Ethan watched her closely, noticing the small changes, the way she started smiling a little more, the way her posture shifted as she grew stronger, both physically and emotionally. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live again. But there were still moments when the past came rushing back. When Grace would sit by the window, staring out at the city, her eyes distant and lost, as though she was searching for something, or perhaps running from something she couldn't escape. Ethan had learned not to press her during those moments. He didn't need to know everything. He just needed to be there. One evening, a few weeks after Grace had moved in, Ethan arrived at the guest house later than usual. He had just finished a long meeting with the board of directors, and his mind was buzzing with thoughts of the company. As he stepped inside, he noticed the quiet. The apartment was darker than usual, the only light coming from the soft glow of a lamp in the corner. Grace was sitting at the small dining table, a piece of paper in front of her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and wariness. "You're home late," she said, her voice hesitant, almost as if she was trying to gauge his mood. Ethan shrugged off his jacket, trying to keep his tone light. "Just another day at the office. How's your day been?" Grace didn't answer immediately. Instead, she gestured toward the paper in front of her. I was trying to make a list of things I could do. Things I could do to, I don't know, start again." Her voice trailed off as she spoke, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Ethan walked over, his curiosity piqued. He glanced at the paper, where Grace had written down a series of small goals, things like get a job, start volunteering, contact old friends. There were also things like reconnect with my family and learn to trust again. The list was a mix of practical and emotional goals, but it was clear that Grace was trying to find a way to take control of her life again. "I think it's a great start," Ethan said, his voice warm with encouragement. "What can I do to help?" Grace shifted in her chair, looking up at him. "I don't know if you can. It's just hard. I don't even know where to begin." Ethan sat down next to her, his eyes meeting hers. "You don't have to do it all at once. We can take it one step at a time." For the first time, Grace smiled, a small, tentative smile, but it was enough. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me." And in that moment, Ethan realized something profound. He hadn't just saved Grace. She had saved him too. In helping her rebuild her life, he had found a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just a project to him. She was a person. And somehow, through their shared vulnerability, they had become more than just strangers passing through each other's lives. The days after Grace had moved into the guest house were a blur of subtle progress and hidden fears. For Ethan, life had become an odd blend of corporate meetings, boardroom drama, and quiet evenings spent with Grace in her new sanctuary. Slowly, he began to feel like he was living two lives at once, one of a wealthy, successful businessman in the city, and the other of someone desperately trying to make a difference in the life of a woman who had once been invisible to him. His own emotions, once carefully guarded and distant, were now entangled with Grace's well-being in ways he hadn't anticipated. But even as Grace started to heal, the world around them was changing, and not for the better. It started small at first. Whispers in the halls of his office, some polite questions from colleagues who were genuinely concerned. "How's she doing?" they'd ask, their voices low, trying to keep their curiosity at bay. Ethan would give them vague, neutral answers, nothing to confirm or deny the rumors that were already starting to spread. But despite his attempts to maintain the appearance of business as usual, It wasn't long before things escalated. It was during a regular Monday morning meeting with his board of directors that Ethan first sensed the full weight of what was happening. He walked into the glass-walled conference room, his mind focused on the financials of the last quarter, the upcoming product launch, and the usual list of to-dos that he had grown so accustomed to. But as soon as he stepped inside, the mood in the room shifted. The tension was palpable. Everyone was already seated, their eyes darting between each other, and then quickly flicking to him. Ethan sat at the head of the table, trying to keep his expression neutral. He knew what this was about. He could feel it in his bones. Richard Hayes, the senior board member with a reputation for being direct, to the point of rudeness, didn't waste time. "Ethan," he began, his tone casual but undercut with an edge. "There's been some chatter lately. The press has caught wind of your little charity project with, what's her name?" He glanced down at his notes, clearly unfazed by the discomfort filling the room. "Grace Miller," Ethan replied, his voice steady but his fists clenching under the table. "Right, Grace Miller, a homeless woman. Pregnant, from what I hear." Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not sure what you're trying to do here, but it's starting to look like a PR stunt, a crisis management move. We've got investors, shareholders, and a reputation to think about. You're playing a dangerous game." Ethan's jaw tightened. He had heard the rumors, seen the media headlines. The whispers behind closed doors had already begun, but hearing them spoken so plainly, so callously, from the people he had trusted with his company, was like a slap to the face. "I'm not playing a game," Ethan said quietly but firmly, meeting Richard's gaze head-on. "I'm helping someone who needs it. I won't apologize for that." Richard didn't back down. "You can't afford to have your personal life turn into a circus, Ethan. This whole situation is a PR nightmare. The press is calling it a midlife crisis, a publicity stunt. Do you want to jeopardize everything we've built?" "Everything?" Ethan repeated, his voice rising slightly. "I've built this company on hard work and integrity, not by treating people like projects. If this costs me everything, then so be it." The room fell silent, the only sound the quiet hum of the air conditioning above their heads. The rest of the board members exchanged uncomfortable glances, unwilling to speak up. Ethan could feel the weight of their collective judgment, but he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not when he had finally found something that mattered more than money. "I'm not cutting ties with Grace," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "You can't force me to do that." Richard's eyes flickered with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. "If you continue down this path, Ethan, you're going to risk losing everything: your reputation, your investors, your position at the helm of this company. Is she really worth that?" Ethan leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to let it all slip away because of some misguided attempt to help someone in need. But as the words hung in the air, he couldn't ignore the undeniable truth that was staring him in the face. Grace was changing him. She had changed him, and it terrified him. "I'm done talking about this," Ethan said sharply, standing up. "If anyone here has a problem with how I choose to live my life, then maybe they should find another place to work." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out of the conference room, his mind racing. He knew he had made the right decision, but the weight of the backlash was heavier than he had anticipated. Richard's words kept echoing in his mind. Is she really worth that? Over the next few days, the whispers grew louder. Media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a scandal. Tech mogul's midlife crisis, millionaire involved with homeless pregnant woman. The tabloid headlines were relentless, feeding on the public's insatiable appetite for gossip. The more they dug into Grace's past, the more they painted her as an opportunist, a woman with a dark history. They ignored her trauma, her pain, and instead reduced her to a story, one of scandal, manipulation, and surprise pregnancy. Grace wasn't just a victim of her circumstances anymore. Now, she was a spectacle. And Ethan? He was caught in the middle. A man trying to do the right thing, but being torn apart by the very people he had trusted. As the media frenzy intensified, the pressure from his board increased. He was summoned to another meeting, this time with even more urgency. The investors were breathing down their necks, demanding answers. Ethan couldn't escape the feeling that they were looking at him as if he were the villain in a story he hadn't even wanted to be a part of. It was on one of these days, after another tense meeting with the board, that Ethan found himself in his office, staring at the phone on his desk. His mind raced, trying to come to terms with the overwhelming sense of guilt and frustration that had taken root inside him. He had promised Grace that he would stand by her no matter what. But was he really willing to risk everything for her? His phone buzzed, breaking his train of thought. It was a text from Maya. "Ethan, you need to see this." He clicked on the link she had sent him. It was an article, this one more personal than the others, filled with rumors and half-truths about Grace. It painted her as a gold digger, a woman using Ethan's compassion to climb the social ladder. But it wasn't the lies that bothered him the most. It was the look of disgust on Grace's face in the accompanying photo. Her eyes, once full of hope, now looked hardened, broken by the cruel spotlight that had been thrust upon her. Ethan slammed the phone down on his desk, his heart sinking. She had to know that this wasn't his doing. But how could he explain that to her? How could he protect her from the damage that was already done? Ethan couldn't shake the heaviness that had settled on his chest in the days following the public backlash. The weight of the media storm, the whispers from his colleagues, and the pressure from his board members all weighed heavily on him. It felt as though the world had shifted beneath his feet, and nothing seemed certain anymore. But through it all, there was one thing he knew with unwavering certainty. He wasn't going to abandon Grace. For the first time in his life, Ethan had been faced with something greater than his career, greater than his wealth, and it was staring him in the face. Grace was more than just a homeless woman who needed help. She was a person who deserved a chance, just like everyone else. Ethan had seen the potential in her. He had witnessed the strength that lay dormant beneath the layers of pain and mistrust. But he also knew that Grace couldn't stay in the guest house forever. She needed more than just a place to sleep. She needed purpose. She needed a way to rebuild her life, to feel like she was contributing to something bigger than herself. And that's when it hit him. Ethan had the resources, the power, and the platform to help her. But more than that, he had the opportunity to make a real difference. It was a challenge he knew he couldn't turn away from. The idea started small, almost casually. He had been sitting in his office, going through his emails, when he came across a community outreach program his company had recently started. It was a new initiative aimed at providing job opportunities and mentorship for people from disadvantaged backgrounds. He had attended the launch event weeks earlier, but it hadn't truly resonated with him until now. Grace could be part of this. She had once been a teacher, a professional. She wasn't just some random person off the street. She had skills, experience, and a drive that Ethan could see even if she didn't fully believe in herself. It didn't take long for the idea to form into something concrete. Ethan picked up his phone and dialed Maya's number. "Maya, I need to talk to you about something important," Ethan said, his voice laced with determination. Maya's voice was cautious. "Sure, Ethan. What's going on?" "I've been thinking about Grace," Ethan began, pacing the length of his office. She needs more than just shelter. She needs a chance to rebuild her life. I want to offer her a position with the company, not just as a charity case, but as someone who can make a real difference in our outreach program." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Maya wasn't someone who got easily shocked, but Ethan could hear the disbelief in her voice. "Ethan, are you sure about this? I mean, it's a great idea, but there are a lot of things to consider. She's been through a lot, and this could stir up even more media attention. You saw what happened last time." "I know the risks," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "But this isn't about the media. This is about giving her the tools to get her life back. She's been through hell, Maya. She deserves more than being judged by her past. We need to give her a chance to show what she can do." Maya sighed, and Ethan could hear her adjusting her stance. Okay. I get it. But we need to have a plan, Ethan. We can't just throw her into something and hope it works." "I'm not throwing her into anything," Ethan said with more conviction. "This isn't about pity. She's got the skills. She was a teacher. She knows how to work with people. I think she could be great for our program." Maya finally relented. "All right, I'll talk to HR and get everything lined up. But we need to be prepared. This could get complicated." Ethan smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Thanks, Maya. I appreciate it." As he hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was determined to help Grace in every way he could. He was committed to seeing her succeed, to proving that a person's past didn't have to define their future. He had been visiting her daily, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't just checking in on her. Today he had a plan. As he walked into the guest house, he saw Grace sitting at the kitchen table, looking over a stack of papers. She was still getting used to the routine of the place, still unsure about her place in the world. But she was improving every day. "Morning," Ethan greeted, walking into the room with a quiet but purposeful energy. Grace looked up, her eyes a bit tired but warmer than they had been in the past. "Morning," she replied, her voice soft but steady. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, meeting her gaze. He had rehearsed this conversation in his head for hours, but now that the moment was here, he found himself unsure of how to begin. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Ethan started, his voice low and thoughtful. "About getting a job, about rebuilding your life. And I think I have an opportunity for you." Grace raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but cautious. "What kind of opportunity?" Ethan smiled, trying to keep his tone as genuine as possible. "I've been working on a community outreach program at my company. It's focused on helping people from disadvantaged backgrounds, giving them a chance to rebuild their careers, and providing mentorship. And I think you'd be a perfect fit." For a moment, Grace was silent, her expression unreadable. Ethan could see the wheels turning in her mind, but he could also see the hesitation, the doubt. "You're offering me a job?" she asked, her voice tentative. Ethan nodded. "Not just any job. This is a real opportunity. You'll be working alongside people who understand what it's like to struggle. And you'll have the chance to use your skills to make a difference. This isn't a charity case, Grace. This is about giving you a platform to show the world what you're capable of." Grace's eyes flickered with uncertainty. She had always been a teacher, someone who believed in helping others. But this was a big leap. She had spent so long hiding in the shadows, trying to survive, that the thought of stepping back into the spotlight was terrifying. "I don't know if I can do this," Grace said, her voice shaky. "I don't even know where to start." Ethan leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You don't have to know everything right now. But you do know one thing. You're not where you want to be. And this could be the first step towards something better. I'm offering you the chance to try. You don't have to do it alone." Grace stared at him, her gaze intense, as if weighing his words. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll give it a try." Ethan's heart swelled with relief and pride. It wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. But this was the beginning of something new, something real. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing the right thing. The morning sunlight filtered softly through the office windows, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors. Ethan leaned back in his chair, scanning the documents in front of him. He had a million things on his mind, but today, something felt different. There was an energy in the air, something electric, and it wasn't just the morning rush or the endless stream of emails. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Grace had accepted the offer, but the reality of it all hadn't quite hit her yet. She had been hesitant at first, her mind clouded with doubt, but when she finally agreed, there had been a subtle change in her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to rebuild. Her first day at the office had been a mixture of nerves and excitement. Ethan had arranged everything, her workspace, her role, and her tasks. And while it was a lot to process, she stepped into the role with determination. She wasn't there to fail. She wasn't there to be the token homeless woman turned success story. She was there to show everyone that she had the potential to make a real impact. The first few days had been a blur. Grace had thrown herself into her work, meeting with the outreach team, reviewing strategies, and attending meetings. It was hard, of course. Every step felt like a mountain to climb. But the spark in her eyes, the determination to prove herself, kept her going. And then, something incredible happened. During a routine strategy meeting with the team, Grace had spoken up. She had been quiet at first, sitting in the back, observing the dynamics of the group. But then, a conversation about the company's outreach initiatives came up, and something clicked in her. She had lived through the struggles they were discussing. She knew what it was like to be ignored, to feel like the system had no place for you. She understood the real-world implications of the company's work in a way no one else could. "I think you're missing something," Grace said, her voice calm but full of conviction. Everyone turned to her, surprised by the sudden interruption. Ethan, sitting at the head of the table, watched her closely. Her eyes were focused, her posture confident. She was a woman who had been through hell and back, and she wasn't afraid to speak her mind anymore. "The program is great," she continued, "but it's not focused enough on the people who need it the most. You're offering opportunities, but you're not offering them to the right people, those who've been left out of the conversation entirely." The room fell silent, everyone looking at her, as though she had just spoken a foreign language. Grace wasn't some naive volunteer, spouting idealistic nonsense. She was telling them something they hadn't seen. And for the first time in the meeting, the entire room seemed to sit up a little straighter, taking her seriously. Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on," he said, his voice steady, encouraging. Grace didn't hesitate. "We're focusing too much on formal education and corporate experience. You're missing people who have the skills, but don't have the paper to prove it. People like me. People who were given a shot, but lost it through no fault of their own. What about them? We need a program that focuses on skill building, not just resumes." The room remained quiet for a few moments, the weight of her words sinking in. Then, one by one, heads began to nod, as if everyone in the room was processing what she had just said. Ethan could feel the shift, an undeniable spark of recognition. She had struck a chord. "You're absolutely right," said Olivia Daniels, the HR manager, who had been skeptical of Grace's involvement at first. Her voice was filled with newfound respect. "We've been so focused on the formalities that we forgot about the people who just need a chance." Ethan watched as the team began to discuss the implications of Grace's proposal. What started as a simple observation had turned into a game-changing insight. The outreach program wasn't just about giving people jobs. It was about equipping them with real-world skills and the belief that they could make something of themselves, even without a polished resume or a degree from an Ivy League school. By the end of the meeting, things had shifted. The team had begun drafting a new strategy, one that included a mentorship program for individuals without formal qualifications, but with the determination and drive to succeed. Grace's voice had been heard, and it had made a difference. Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as he watched Grace quietly slip out of the room. Her face flushed with both the exertion of speaking up and the satisfaction of being understood. She wasn't the same woman who had first stumbled into his office months ago, asking for help. She had become someone capable of shaping the direction of the company, someone whose voice mattered. Later that day, Ethan sought her out in her office, eager to acknowledge her contribution. He found her sitting at her desk, going over more files, her face concentrated. She didn't see him standing there for a moment, so he cleared his throat to catch her attention. Grace looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Ethan, I didn't hear you come in." Ethan smiled, leaning against the doorframe. "That's because you were too busy changing the game," he replied, walking toward her. "You were amazing in that meeting today, Grace. You've really made an impact." Grace's cheeks flushed with modesty, but she couldn't hide the pride in her eyes. "I just said what I thought. It's what you hired me for, right? To bring a fresh perspective?" Ethan's heart swelled. "Exactly. But you've done more than that. You've given us all something to think about. You've shown us that we need to listen to people like you. Real people." Grace didn't know how to respond to that. A part of her still couldn't fully accept that she had been the one to make such a difference. She wasn't used to being listened to, let alone being the one who drove change. "Thank you, Ethan," she said quietly, "for believing in me." Ethan smiled, and for the first time, the weight of the public backlash seemed a little lighter. This moment was what mattered. Not the judgment from his board, not the negative headlines, but the way Grace had found her voice and used it to push for real change. Grace threw herself into her new role, working with the outreach team to create materials for the revised program. She met with potential candidates, offering advice, guidance, and sometimes just a listening ear. For the first time, she felt like she was truly contributing. She wasn't a burden. She wasn't a project. She was part of something bigger, a movement toward change. But, as always, progress came with challenges. The increased attention on Grace and her involvement with the company didn't go unnoticed by the media. The headlines continued to spew their narrative, twisting her story into one of opportunism. "Homeless woman turned corporate mentor" was the latest sensational headline, a title that didn't sit right with Grace. She wasn't a media spectacle. She wasn't a symbol of success. She was a woman with real pain, real struggles, and real goals. But as the media buzzed and the critics continued to pick apart every detail of her life, Grace remained steadfast. She was no longer willing to let her past define her. She had a new purpose, a new identity, and that was all that mattered. Grace was beginning to feel like she could finally breathe again. After months of uncertainty, after struggling with her past and trying to piece together the life she once had, she was slowly starting to rebuild. Every day at the company was a challenge, but it was a challenge she welcomed. She wasn't just the charity case anymore. She had earned her place, and she was going to make the most of it. But even as she embraced this new chapter of her life, a shadow from her past was waiting for her, lurking just beyond her reach, ready to pull her back into a world she had fought so hard to escape. It started with a phone call, one she hadn't been expecting. The call came on a rainy Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that felt heavy with memories and unspoken words. Grace had been at the office, going over paperwork for the new outreach program, when her phone buzzed on her desk. She glanced at the screen and saw a name she hadn't thought about in years, Michael Carter. Her stomach dropped. Michael, her ex-fiancé, the man she had once believed she would build a life with. The man who had promised to be her partner, only to betray her when life got hard. He was the reason she was here, broken, homeless, lost. When they had first met, everything had seemed so perfect. They had been a team, working toward their future, planning their lives together. But then the layoffs had come, and with them, everything had unraveled. Michael had left her, turning his back on her when she needed him the most. Grace hesitated for a moment before answering. She knew this wasn't going to be good. She had spent years trying to forget Michael, trying to erase him from her life. But there he was, still haunting her with his call. "Hello?" she answered, her voice steady despite the fear rising in her chest. "Grace?" Michael's voice came through the phone, his tone laced with an all-too-familiar arrogance. "I've been trying to get in touch with you. You know, we need to talk." Grace's pulse quickened. "What do you want, Michael?" "I'm owed money," Michael said bluntly, as if the years between them had never existed. "You know that loan I gave you when you were living with me? It's time to pay up. I've been patient, but I can't wait any longer. I need you to transfer the money now." Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She had forgotten about that loan. It wasn't a traditional loan. Not really. It was something Michael had lent her after she lost her job, a way to control her. But Grace had never agreed to any formal arrangement. She had taken it out of desperation, thinking it would be temporary, that everything would work out. But it hadn't. And now, Michael was using it as leverage. "I don't owe you anything," Grace replied, her voice tight. "You don't get to come back into my life and demand anything from me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Michael spoke again, his voice dark and insistent. "You owe me everything, Grace. And if you don't pay up, I'll make sure the whole world knows what kind of person you really are. You think they'll be so eager to help you once they know the truth? Once they know you're just another gold digger who used a rich guy to climb the social ladder?" Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the walls closing in, the familiar anxiety creeping up on her. Michael was threatening to expose her past, to drag her name through the mud once again. The fear was suffocating, but she refused to let him control her. Not again. Not ever. "You don't get to dictate my life anymore," Grace said firmly, each word feeling like it took all her strength. "I'm done with you." She hung up before he could say another word, her hands trembling as she set the phone down on her desk. For a moment, she sat there in silence, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a heavy stone. She had built so much since that dark time in her life. Her job, her confidence, her sense of self. And now Michael was threatening to destroy it all, with a few words. But Grace wasn't going to let him win. She had fought too hard to get to this point, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially him, drag her back into the shadows. A few hours later, Ethan walked into the office with his usual sense of purpose. But today, there was a palpable tension in the air. Grace had been distant ever since the call, and Ethan could tell something was wrong. He had been watching her from across the room, but he hadn't wanted to intrude. He respected her space, knowing how fragile she could be at times. But now, as he walked up to her desk, he couldn't ignore the way she was staring at the screen, her face pale and drawn. Her hands were clasped tightly together, as though she were holding herself together, but barely. "Grace?" Ethan's voice was soft, but it cut through the silence like a blade. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I'm fine," she said quickly, but the words didn't match the exhaustion etched into her features. "Grace, what's going on?" Ethan's voice was gentle but firm. He had learned by now that when Grace didn't want to talk, she would shut down completely. But this was different. She was a different person now, and Ethan wasn't about to let her hide from him. She hesitated for a moment, the weight of her thoughts clearly battling with her need to protect herself. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping, as if she had reached her breaking point. "It's Michael," she said quietly. "He called me today." Ethan's eyes darkened, and he sat down across from her, his posture tense. "What did he want?" He wants the money I owe him," Grace replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The loan he gave me. He says I need to pay him back, or he'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person I am. He'll expose everything." Ethan clenched his jaw, his anger rising. "Grace, you don't owe him anything. He took advantage of you, manipulated you. That's not your fault." "I know that," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. "But it doesn't matter what I know. He can ruin everything I've worked for. The media, the company, my job. They'll all turn against me if he tells them about my past. I can't let that happen." Ethan reached out and gently took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "Grace, you're not alone in this. I'll make sure he doesn't hurt you. We'll find a way to deal with him." Grace's eyes flickered with hesitation. "How?" "He's got leverage, he's got power, and he's not afraid to use it." "I don't care what power he thinks he has," Ethan said, his voice firm. "You have something he'll never have: integrity, strength, and the ability to rebuild. We'll take care of this together. I promise." For the first time in a long while, Grace felt a flicker of hope. She had been so used to fighting alone, to being the one who had to keep her head above water, that the idea of having someone stand by her, truly stand by her, felt like a lifeline. "I don't want to drag you into this, Ethan," she said quietly. "You're not dragging me into anything," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "You're part of my life now, Grace. I'm not going anywhere." The days following Michael's call had been a whirlwind for Grace. She had never expected him to show up in her life again, not after everything had ended between them. But there he was, threatening her, reminding her of the vulnerability she had fought so hard to overcome. Every hour felt like a battle. The weight of his words lingered in her mind, the fear of being exposed, of having her entire past paraded in front of the world, gnawing at her insides. But Ethan was there. Despite the storm brewing around her, Ethan had been steadfast, offering support without hesitation. He had shown up at her office with an unwavering determination to protect her, and slowly, she had started to trust him in a way she never thought possible. They had spent hours strategizing, figuring out how to handle Michael and the looming threat he posed. Ethan had made it clear that he wasn't going to let Grace face this alone, and she found herself relying on him in ways she hadn't allowed herself to before. It was terrifying. The thought of needing someone, of depending on them, made her feel exposed, vulnerable, but at the same time, it felt like a lifeline. The problem was, the more she spent time with Ethan, the more she felt herself opening up, revealing parts of her past that she had buried for so long. She had never shared the full extent of what had happened to her, of the struggles she had faced, the guilt that weighed heavily on her. She had always kept those things hidden, tucked away in the corners of her mind where no one could see. But Ethan had a way of breaking down her walls, of making her feel safe enough to confront her past. And it scared her. It was a quiet Friday evening when it finally happened. Grace had been working late, as she often did, trying to stay busy, to keep her mind off everything that had happened. Ethan had been by her side most of the day, offering encouragement and listening to her ideas for the new outreach program. They had laughed together, talked about everything from work to life, and for the first time in a long time, Grace had felt something other than fear and uncertainty. As the office emptied out and the last of the employees trickled out the door, Grace found herself sitting across from Ethan in the now empty conference room. The city lights from outside, reflected in the glass walls, casting a soft glow over the room. Ethan was leaning back in his chair, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. "Grace," he said quietly, breaking the silence, "you've been carrying this weight for a long time, haven't you?" Grace swallowed hard, her throat tight. She knew exactly what he meant. She had been hiding her past, holding on to the guilt and shame of everything that had happened with Michael. With her fall from grace, she had never let anyone see how broken she truly was. But Ethan wasn't asking her to forget it or hide it anymore. He was asking her to confront it. "I have," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "It's hard, Ethan. It's hard to let go of everything. The mistakes, the things I can't undo." Ethan didn't say anything at first. He just watched her with a steady, patient gaze, as if he was waiting for her to find the courage to keep speaking. "I've always felt like I wasn't good enough," Grace continued, her voice shaking. "Like I wasn't worthy of success or happiness. And when things went wrong, when everything fell apart, I couldn't handle it. I couldn't face the fact that I had failed. So I ran. I hid. And now, every time I think I've made some progress, something like Michael happens, and it feels like I'm right back where I started." The words came tumbling out in a rush, the weight of them finally lifting as she spoke. She hadn't realized just how much she had been holding in, how much she had been trying to carry on her own. The burden of it all had been crushing. But now, as she confessed it aloud, it felt like a small relief. Ethan was silent for a long time, his gaze never leaving her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, filled with understanding. "Grace, you're not defined by your past. You've done things, real, meaningful things, that prove who you are. You're strong, and you've fought for everything you've achieved. That's who you are. Not the mistakes you made, not the people who've hurt you. Just you." Grace shook her head, unable to believe him. "But I don't know how to let go. I don't know how to forgive myself." "You don't have to do it all at once," Ethan said softly, leaning forward slightly. "But you have to start somewhere. And you don't have to do it alone." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away, embarrassed. She had never let anyone see her this vulnerable, not even Michael, not even the people who had been closest to her. But Ethan wasn't like the others. He wasn't judging her. He was just there, offering his support, giving her a space to breathe. "I don't know if I can do this," Grace whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know if I can be what you think I am. I don't know if I deserve this." Ethan stood up and walked around the table to where she sat, then gently placed his hand on hers. "Grace, you don't have to be anything other than who you are. You don't need to prove anything to me. I'm not here because I think you're some kind of charity case. I'm here because I believe in you. And I think you've started to believe in yourself, too." Grace looked up at him, her heart racing. There was something in his eyes, a softness, an understanding, that made her believe him. He wasn't just saying the words, he meant them. And for the first time in a long time, Grace felt a spark of hope, of possibility, where there had once been only doubt. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Scared that if I let go, I'll fall apart. Scared that if I trust too much, I'll get hurt again." Ethan's expression softened, and he gently squeezed her hand. "You don't have to trust everyone, but you can trust me. I'm not going anywhere, Grace. We'll take it one step at a time, together." For the first time, Grace allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something better. She didn't have to carry her past alone. She didn't have to face the world on her own. And as Ethan's words settled into her heart, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she could start to heal. The rest of the evening passed in a quiet, peaceful silence. Grace felt lighter, more at ease than she had in months. It wasn't a complete resolution to all her struggles, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like a step in the right direction. The city lights flickered as Grace walked into the office building early on a Monday morning. The air was thick with anticipation, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. She had been working with Ethan for several months now, but every day felt like a new chapter in her life, one that she hadn't anticipated but was beginning to embrace. Her first weeks at the company had been a blur of new faces, new tasks, and new responsibilities. But more than that, she had been discovering something about herself, something she had never thought possible. She was learning to trust again, to believe in herself, and perhaps, most unexpectedly, to open up to the idea of relationships. And none of this would have been possible without Ethan. He had always been there for her, supporting her as she navigated the challenges of the outreach program, offering guidance when she needed it, and giving her the space to grow. He wasn't just her boss anymore. Over the weeks, they had become something more, something that neither of them had expected. It had started slowly, late-night meetings in the office, casual conversations over coffee, shared laughs over lunch. It wasn't as if they had made a decision to get closer. It just happened. Ethan wasn't like the other men in her life. He wasn't trying to fix her or save her. He simply saw her. And for someone who had been discarded by others, that feeling was a revelation. But there were still walls in Grace's heart. She wasn't ready to acknowledge them yet. But deep down, she knew the truth. She was falling for him. It wasn't just his generosity or his support. It was the way he saw her, the way he made her feel like she wasn't a charity case, but an equal. It was the way he cared, not just about her past, but about the person she was becoming. But she couldn't shake the nagging fear that this wasn't real, that she was just another project for him, a distraction from his successful life. She wasn't ready to let her guard down. Not yet. It was a typical Monday morning when Grace received a message from Maya, her HR manager. "There's a team-building event this weekend. You're going, right?" Grace sighed as she read the message. She knew the event was part of the company's ongoing efforts to foster teamwork and improve communication. Everyone was expected to attend, but for Grace, it felt like another test, a chance to see if she could truly fit in with the company's elite crowd. She wasn't sure if she was ready for that. When she first joined the company, she had been an outsider, a woman with a rough past trying to fit into a world she didn't understand. But now, months later, things had started to change. Grace had earned the respect of her colleagues, especially after her groundbreaking suggestions to improve the company's outreach program. People were starting to see her for what she truly was, A woman with vision, not just a charity case. Still, she didn't know how she would feel surrounded by her colleagues, all of them high-powered professionals. And Ethan, would he still see her as an equal once they were out of the office? Or would the divide between his world and hers feel even greater? She typed a quick reply to Maya. "I'll be there." As she sent the message, her heart raced with a mixture of anxiety and excitement. This was a new step, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. The weekend arrived quickly. Ethan had been unusually quiet the day before, and Grace wasn't sure why. When she arrived at the venue, a sprawling lakeside resort just outside the city, she was surprised to find Ethan already there, standing near the registration table, looking every bit the successful entrepreneur he was. He looked out of place in the casual setting, his usual sharp business attire replaced by a simple polo shirt and khakis. "Grace," he called when he saw her. There was an ease in his voice that made her feel immediately at home, even though the setting was anything but familiar. "Hey," she replied, forcing a smile despite the nerves bubbling inside her. "How's it going?" "It's going," he said with a grin. "The whole team is here, and I think we're going to have a lot of fun. You ready for some team building?" Grace hesitated, glancing around at the other attendees. She could feel the weight of her insecurities rising again, but Ethan's presence seemed to steady her. "I guess I'm ready," she said, trying to sound confident. As they made their way inside, Grace found herself becoming more and more comfortable in Ethan's presence. He wasn't just talking to her as his employee. He was talking to her like they were equals. The more time she spent with him, the more she realized how much she admired him, not just for his success, but for his compassion, his ability to truly see people. It was a rare trait, and it was what made him so different from everyone else she had ever met. The team-building event was a mix of challenges, group discussions, and outdoor activities. But what stood out to Grace the most wasn't the competitive spirit or the teamwork that was being encouraged. It was the way Ethan interacted with everyone. He wasn't just a leader. He was a part of the team. He took the time to listen to each person, to make them feel valued. And when he spoke to Grace, his words were always thoughtful, always kind. There was an ease in his demeanor that made everyone around him feel comfortable. By the time the event wound down, Grace found herself sitting next to Ethan by the lake, the soft glow of the sunset casting a warm light over the water. The last of the team members were packing up, but neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. "It's beautiful here," Grace said, gazing out at the shimmering water. "I don't think I've ever taken the time to really enjoy a moment like this." Ethan nodded, his gaze also fixed on the water. "Sometimes we're so caught up in the next thing, we forget to appreciate what's right in front of us." Grace turned her head to look at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I guess that's something I've been learning lately, to just be present." Ethan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to disappear. There was an intensity in his gaze that made Grace's heart race. "I'm glad you're here, Grace. I'm glad you're part of this team, part of this company. You're more than just someone I'm helping. You're someone I'm proud to work with." Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. His words, so simple, yet so genuine, sent a surge of emotion through her. She had never expected to hear something like that from him, not from someone so powerful, so accomplished. She had never felt truly seen until now. I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't have to say anything," Ethan said softly, his voice warm and sincere. "Just know that I believe in you. And I'm here, Grace. I'm here for whatever you need." In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just professional respect anymore. It was something deeper, something that neither of them could ignore. They had been through so much together, and the connection they shared was undeniable. Grace smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of more. More than just a job. More than just a friendship. Maybe, just maybe, it could be something even greater. Grace walked into the office building early that Monday, her steps slow but determined. The weekend had been a blur, a mix of quiet moments with Ethan and the gnawing tension in the back of her mind. Everything had felt so right when they were together. But now, in the office, the world outside their bubble was beginning to change, and not for the better. The phone call from Michael had left her shaken. Despite Ethan's assurances that he would protect her, there was a lingering fear she couldn't shake. The idea that Michael could expose her past, could ruin everything she had worked for, still haunted her. The media had already begun to pick up on her story, and while many of the headlines were positive, there were always those waiting for the moment she would slip. And then it happened. Grace had barely settled into her desk when Maya Carter, her trusted HR manager, called her into the conference room. The tension in Maya's voice was unmistakable, and the moment Grace entered the room, she could tell something had gone terribly wrong. "What's going on?" Grace asked, her heart beginning to race. Maya's eyes were hard, focused, and there was a sense of urgency in the air. "It's Michael," Maya said, her tone low. "He's talking to the press." Grace froze, her worst fear coming true in real time. "What's he saying?" Maya hesitated for a moment, glancing around as though afraid someone might overhear. "He's painting you as a manipulator. He's telling reporters that you only got this position because of Ethan's guilt, that you've been using him to climb the corporate ladder, and he's making you out to be a fraud." The words hit Grace like a slap in the face. "No," she whispered, unable to believe it. "This isn't happening. He's also claiming that you owe him money and that you've been lying about your past. This could ruin you, Grace. And it could ruin Ethan, too." Grace felt like the world was crashing down around her. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life, to make something of herself, and now Michael was trying to tear it all apart. The thought of the media frenzy, of people turning on her, filled her with dread. It wasn't just her future on the line. It was Ethan's, too. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Maya's eyes softened, but her words were harsh. "We need to get ahead of this, Grace. We need to make sure the company doesn't suffer. We need to control the narrative before Michael spins it any further." Grace's mind raced. She couldn't let Michael win. She couldn't let him expose her weaknesses for the world to see. But the thought of publicly defending herself, of revealing her past, terrified her. How could she do that? How could she face the world when her past was filled with so much shame? Ethan was the next person to walk into the room. His usual confidence was tempered by a shadow of concern, and when he saw the look on Grace's face, he immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He stepped toward her, his gaze unwavering. "We'll handle this together, Grace." Grace looked at him, but she couldn't bring herself to speak. She felt exposed. The weight of Michael's words, the pressure to defend herself, it all felt too much. The man she had once trusted, the man who had abandoned her at her lowest point, was now using the media to destroy her. "Don't worry," Ethan continued, his voice calm and reassuring. "We'll get ahead of this. I'll make sure the press knows the truth. And if Michael keeps pushing, we'll take legal action. You don't have to face this alone." Grace nodded, but her heart wasn't in it. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to trust that everything would be okay. But a part of her, the part that had been hurt so many times before, couldn't quite let go of the fear. Later that afternoon, Ethan called an emergency meeting with the board. Grace had been invited, but she wasn't sure if she was ready to face them all. The whispers, the judgment, the stares, it all felt suffocating. But she knew she had no choice. This was her fight, and she wasn't going to let Michael take away everything she had worked for. The boardroom was tense, the air thick with unspoken thoughts. As Ethan stood in front of the room, addressing the group, Grace could feel the weight of their gazes on her. They were all watching, judging, waiting for her to crack. "This situation is bigger than just one person," Ethan said, his voice steady. "We've seen the press reports, and I'm here to tell you that they're lies. Grace Miller is not a manipulator, and she's not a fraud. She has worked tirelessly to earn her place here, and we are not going to let anyone, least of all Michael Carter, ruin her reputation or the progress we've made as a company." The room was silent, the members exchanging glances. Grace could feel the tension in the air. Some of them looked uncertain, unsure of whether to believe Ethan or to take the side of the press. But Ethan stood firm, his back straight, his gaze unwavering. "We will be addressing the press tomorrow," he continued. "I'm going to make sure that everyone knows the truth. Grace and I have nothing to hide. This is not just about protecting her. It's about protecting the values we stand for as a company. Integrity, honesty, and support for those who need it the most." As Ethan finished speaking, Grace could feel the weight of the room's judgment slowly lifting. Some of the board members nodded, clearly in agreement with his stance, while others seemed unsure, their eyes still clouded with doubt. Richard Hayes, the head of the board, was the first to speak. "We understand your position, Ethan, but you must also understand that the press is a powerful force. If this story spreads, it could harm the company's image. We need to think about the long-term consequences of this." Ethan turned toward Richard, his gaze sharp. "The long-term consequences are what we stand for. Grace is a part of this company, and we aren't going to let anyone tear her down. If you can't support that, then maybe it's time to rethink your place here." The room fell into a stunned silence. Grace's heart raced as she watched Ethan's confrontation with Richard. She had never seen him so forceful, so protective of her. It was a side of him she hadn't fully realized until now. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. "We'll support you, Ethan, but we need a clear plan to address the media." Ethan nodded. "We'll issue a statement, clear and concise. And I'll personally speak to the press. This is our chance to take control of the narrative." The following day, Ethan and Grace sat together in the conference room, preparing for the press conference. Grace had never been one for public speaking. The thought of standing in front of a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing, the world watching her every move, it felt like a nightmare. But Ethan was by her side, offering reassurance. "We'll do this together, Grace. I'll be right there with you. You don't have to do this alone." As the press arrived and the cameras began to click, Grace felt a knot form in her stomach. The room was filled with reporters, all eager to hear what Ethan had to say. But this wasn't just about Ethan. It was about Grace. It was about taking back control of her story. When it was time to speak, Ethan stood confidently at the podium, his presence commanding the room. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today we are addressing the false accusations that have been circulating about Grace Miller. The claims made by Michael Carter are not only inaccurate, they are damaging. Grace Miller is not a gold digger, and she is certainly not here to manipulate anyone. She is a hard-working, dedicated professional who has earned her place at this company. She has been a driving force behind our outreach initiatives, and we stand by her 100%. As Ethan spoke, Grace felt her body tense, but then something unexpected happened. She felt a wave of relief wash over her. Ethan's words were like a shield, protecting her from the onslaught of judgment. She wasn't just hearing him speak about her. She was hearing him defend her, stand by her, in front of the entire world. The press conference ended with a few questions from the reporters, but they were nowhere near as harsh as Grace had feared. The media, once intent on tearing her apart, was now taking a more measured tone. Ethan had taken control of the narrative, and it was clear that Grace was no longer the villain in the story. But even as the press shifted their focus, Grace knew the battle was far from over. Michael's threat still loomed, and the pressure to prove herself, to show that she truly belonged, was still there. The early morning sun had barely begun to rise over the skyline when Ethan found himself standing in front of the office windows, staring out at the city below. The world was waking up, the hustle and bustle of the streets just starting to pick up as the city came alive. Yet for Ethan, there was a strange stillness inside him, a quiet determination mixed with a growing sense of purpose settled over him as he prepared for the day ahead. Yesterday's press conference had been a turning point, but Ethan knew that the real battle was just beginning. The media had been forced to pivot their focus, but Michael's influence was far-reaching. Grace's past was now an open book, and Michael was relentless. He had promised to make her life difficult, and Ethan knew that he had to be prepared for whatever came next. As he sipped his coffee, the sound of the office door opening caught his attention. Grace walked in, her steps measured but graceful, her usual confident demeanor masking the lingering uncertainty in her eyes. Ethan noticed the slight tension in her posture, the way her gaze darted around the room, as if she were waiting for the next storm to hit. "Morning," Ethan greeted her, his voice calm but firm. "How are you feeling?" Grace hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't know," she said, her voice soft but tinged with the weight of everything that had happened. "Yesterday was overwhelming, but I guess it was necessary. I just don't know what comes next." Ethan set down his coffee, his eyes locking with hers. "What comes next is us. Together. We'll handle whatever comes our way." Grace smiled weakly, not appreciating his words, but she couldn't ignore the storm brewing inside her. She had spent so long running from her past, keeping it buried beneath layers of walls and defenses, that the idea of confronting it head-on, in front of the entire world, terrified her. But there was no turning back now. Michael had forced her hand, and now it was up to her to stand strong. Later that morning, the news coverage of the press conference began to settle in. The reporters who had been so eager to tear Grace down were now singing a different tune. Headlines had shifted, focusing on the fact that Ethan had stood by her, defending her, and making it clear that he would not be swayed by public opinion. The shift in the narrative felt like a small victory, but it was far from over. Grace knew the world was watching, waiting for her to slip up. They wanted to see if she could really rise above the pain of her past, or if she would falter under the pressure. As the day unfolded, Ethan continued to receive calls from reporters, colleagues, and business associates, all eager to comment on the situation. But he handled it all with the same calm demeanor, making sure that the message stayed consistent. Grace was not a liability. She was an asset, and he wasn't going to let anyone, including Michael, take that away from her. At noon, Ethan called for an emergency meeting with the board. He knew that the coming days would be crucial. The board had expressed their concerns about the company's image, and although they had backed him during the press conference, there was still the matter of business to address. The media's shift in focus had given them some breathing room, but he knew that Grace's past would continue to be a sticking point for some of the more conservative members. As the board members filed into the conference room, Ethan could sense the tension in the air. Richard Hayes, the board's chair, took his usual seat at the head of the table. His eyes narrowed as he looked over Ethan. "You've made it clear, Ethan, that Grace is valuable to the company," Richard said, his voice cool. "But there are still questions we need to answer. We can't ignore the impact this situation is having on our reputation. How do you plan to keep this from affecting the bottom line?" Ethan met Richard's gaze, his own expression hardening. "What's more important, Richard? Our reputation or our values?" he asked, his voice unwavering. "Grace is part of this company. She has worked harder than anyone here, and she deserves to be here. The press, the board, everyone needs to understand that. If we let someone like Michael Carter dictate the narrative, then we're no better than the people who exploit others for their own gain." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, the other members of the board exchanged looks, some of them clearly uneasy, others looking to Ethan for guidance. "We've made a decision," Ethan continued, his voice stronger now. "I'm not going to back down. I'm not going to let Michael win. If this company wants to continue growing, we need to stand by our people. We need to show that we believe in second chances, in redemption. If we can't support Grace, then we have no business claiming to be a company that cares about making a difference." There was a moment of silence, but then a few board members nodded in agreement. Ethan had made his point. He wasn't backing down, and neither was Grace. She had earned her place, and she wasn't going to be forced out by a man who had nothing but resentment for her. Richard finally spoke, his voice begrudging but clear. "All right, Ethan, but we're going to need to handle the fallout carefully. The press is still going to be a challenge." Ethan nodded. "We'll take it one step at a time, but I'm not going to let them tear us down." That evening, Ethan and Grace met at the apartment, their usual quiet space, where they could talk without the weight of the world watching. Grace sat on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant as she stared out the window at the city lights. "You've been incredible, Grace," Ethan said softly, sitting beside her. "You've handled all of this with more strength than I could ever imagine. I know this hasn't been easy, but I want you to know that I'm with you. Always." Grace turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, something she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge yet. She didn't know how to express it, how to explain the feelings that had been growing between them. She had always been cautious, keeping her distance from people. But with Ethan, everything felt different. He wasn't just the man who had saved her career. He was the man who had saved her heart. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay you for everything you've done for me, for standing by me when no one else would." "You don't have to repay me," Ethan replied, his voice gentle but firm. "This isn't about me. This is about you, Grace. You're more than just someone I'm helping. You're someone I believe in." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared words hanging in the air. Then, Grace finally spoke, her voice trembling with the emotion she had been holding back. "I don't know what to do with all of this," she said, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. "I never expected any of this. This job, this life, you. I'm scared that if I let myself believe it, if I let myself feel something for you, I'll lose it." Ethan's hand gently reached for hers, his fingers warm against hers. "You don't have to be afraid, Grace. I'm not going anywhere, not this time." The words hit her like a wave, washing away the last of the walls she had built around her heart. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Grace allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future, of a life that wasn't defined by her past. And maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something more than she ever imagined. The first few days following the press conference had been a blur for Grace. She had expected the media frenzy, the whispers, and the judgment, but nothing had prepared her for the weight of it all. Even with Ethan standing beside her, offering his unwavering support, the sense of vulnerability and fear never quite left her. The world had been watching her every move, analyzing her, waiting for her to fail. But as the days passed, Grace began to realize that she couldn't let the opinions of others control her life. She had spent too much time letting fear dictate her choices. Now, with Ethan's support, she was ready to rebuild. She was ready to take control of her own future. Grace stood in front of the full-length mirror in her apartment, running her fingers through her hair, her mind racing. She had been working tirelessly at the office, focusing on the community outreach program. But today, something felt different. Today she was going to take another step forward, not just in her career, but in her life. Her reflection stared back at her, still the same woman, but with a new purpose. A woman who had survived, who had fought against the odds, who was no longer defined by her past. Grace was more than just a survivor. She was a leader, and she was ready to prove it to herself and to the world. As she turned to leave her apartment, she grabbed her phone, scanning the messages and emails that had accumulated over the past few days. Most of them were from well-meaning colleagues offering their support, but some were from the media, asking for comments, for interviews. She ignored them all. She wasn't interested in speaking to anyone who didn't see her for who she was now. Not the homeless woman of the past, but the strong, capable woman she had become. When Grace arrived at the office, she was greeted with a mixture of curious glances and quiet murmurs. She had become something of a celebrity over the past few days, but it wasn't the kind of fame she had wanted. Despite the shift in the media's coverage, some people still looked at her with skepticism. Some still saw her as a liability. But she didn't care anymore. She had made a decision that day to stop hiding, to stop feeling like she was walking on eggshells, afraid of what others thought. She was going to rebuild her place here, in the company, and in the world. Ethan was waiting for her in the conference room when she arrived. He was already deep in conversation with Maya and Olivia, his usual calm demeanor never faltering, despite the pressure he must have been under. Grace felt a surge of gratitude for him. He had stood by her when no one else would, and now it was her turn to stand by him, to prove that she was just as committed to their shared vision. "Grace," Ethan said, as he looked up, his face lighting up with a warm smile. "Glad you could make it. We're just discussing the new initiatives for the outreach program." Grace nodded, her heart racing at the thought of the project she had poured so much into. It wasn't just a work assignment anymore. It was her way of proving herself, her way of showing the world that she was capable of much more than they had given her credit for. "Let's get started," she said, her voice firm, confident. As the meeting progressed, Grace found herself becoming more and more involved. She was no longer sitting on the sidelines, unsure of her place. She had earned the right to speak, to offer her ideas, and to take charge. Ethan sat back and watched, his expression filled with pride, as Grace led the discussion with ease. She was no longer the quiet, uncertain woman who had arrived at the company months ago. She was a leader. "Grace," Maya said, breaking into Grace's thoughts, "we've been talking about expanding our outreach to younger professionals from disadvantaged backgrounds. You have a lot of experience with that, don't you?" Grace nodded, her mind immediately going to the students she had once taught, the kids who had so much potential but little support. She had been one of them, struggling to find her place in a world that seemed to have forgotten people like her. But now, She had a chance to make a difference, to be the support that had been lacking in her own life. "I do," Grace said, her voice steady. "I think it's crucial to offer mentorship, not just financial support. These young people need guidance, a vision of what's possible for them. We can't just give them money. We need to help them see their potential." Ethan's eyes met hers, and for a moment, she could see the pride in them. He didn't have to say anything. She could tell he was proud of the work she was doing, the changes she was making. And that validation meant more to her than anything. As the day went on, Grace found herself feeling more at ease in the office. The tension that had once held her in a vice grip had started to loosen. She was no longer afraid to speak her mind, to offer her ideas, or to assert her place in the company. She had earned her spot here, not because of pity, not because of Ethan's kindness, but because of her own skills, her own hard work. When the workday came to an end, Grace found herself at the office door, her hand on the handle. She looked back at Ethan, who was finishing up a conversation with Olivia. For a moment, she hesitated. The past few months had been a whirlwind of emotions, of changes and of challenges. But now, for the first time, Grace felt like she was in control. "I'll see you tomorrow?" Ethan asked, his voice warm as he caught her eye. Grace smiled, nodding. "Yeah, see you tomorrow." As she walked out into the crisp evening air, Grace couldn't help but feel a sense of pride swelling in her chest. She had come so far, farther than she had ever imagined possible. And though the world still looked at her with a mixture of doubt and curiosity, she knew that she was no longer the woman who had wandered the streets, looking for a way out. She was stronger than that. She had rebuilt her life, piece by piece, and now she was ready for whatever came next. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt like she was truly on the right path. And as she glanced at her phone, seeing a message from Ethan asking her to meet him for dinner, she couldn't help but smile. She wasn't alone anymore. She had found something, someone, that made the journey worthwhile. The sound of a quiet, steady rain tapped against the windows of Grace's apartment as she sat on the couch, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. The city outside was shrouded in a blanket of gray, but inside, there was a warmth that she had come to cherish. Ethan's presence, as ever constant as it was, filled the room with a comfort she hadn't known she needed. For the past few weeks, Grace had been reflecting on the changes in her life, the monumental shifts that had happened in such a short period. From the woman who had wandered the streets of the city, lost and alone, to the confident, purposeful woman who now had a seat at the table of one of the most prestigious companies in the industry. It felt like a dream, but it was real. She had earned this. And yet, despite all the progress she had made, there was still a part of her that felt uncertain. There was still that nagging fear, the remnants of the woman who had been discarded by the world, who still felt like an imposter in a life she hadn't expected. But as she looked up from her coffee, her gaze meeting Ethan's across the room, that uncertainty slowly faded. The man sitting on the chair opposite her was no longer just her employer, the man who had saved her career. Ethan was someone more, someone she couldn't ignore anymore, someone she had come to care for deeply. "You've been quiet today," Ethan remarked, his voice warm, as he set his own cup down on the coffee table. His eyes, always so steady, never wavered when they met hers. "What's on your mind?" Grace hesitated for a moment. She wasn't sure how to put her feelings into words, especially after everything they had been through together. But she knew she needed to express herself, to let him know how she was feeling. "I'm just thinking," she said finally, her voice quiet. "Thinking about everything that's happened, how far we've come. I never imagined this would be my life. But here we are." Ethan smiled, his eyes softening as he moved to sit beside her. He reached out, placing his hand gently on hers. "I'm glad we're here, Grace. You've worked harder than anyone else to get here. You deserve everything you have." Grace swallowed, the lump in her throat growing as she looked at him. "I just don't want to screw it up. I don't want to go back to the person I used to be, the person who didn't believe she could have this kind of life. I don't know if I'll ever fully believe I'm worthy of it." Ethan's expression softened even further as he looked at her. "You don't need to be afraid of that. You've already proven who you are, Grace. The woman I see is strong, compassionate, and capable of far more than she even realizes. You don't need to worry about what you were. It's who you are now that matters." Grace felt her heart swell as she looked at him. His words, as always, were a balm to her insecurities. She wasn't just some project to him. She was someone he cared for deeply, and that meant the world to her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I'm glad I'm not alone anymore. I'm glad you're here." Ethan leaned forward, brushing a strand of hair away from her face, before speaking softly, his words deliberate. "You've never been alone, Grace. Not really. You've just had to find your way back to where you belong. And you're here now, with me." The next few weeks flew by in a whirlwind of activity. Grace continued to lead the community outreach program with an unwavering passion, her presence at the company now fully established. People respected her, admired her, and while some still whispered about her past, it no longer seemed to matter. The work she had done spoke louder than any judgment. As for Ethan, his support had never wavered. Every decision he made, every step he took, was done with the same certainty that had first drawn Grace to him. She wasn't just another project. She was his equal, his partner, someone who had earned the right to stand beside him in every aspect of life. But as their professional lives flourished, there was something else growing between them, something neither of them could deny anymore. It was on a quiet evening, a week after a particularly successful presentation on expanding the outreach program, that Ethan finally said the words Grace had been waiting to hear. They had just finished dinner at her apartment, and the two of them were sitting on the couch, enjoying a rare moment of peace. The city lights glimmered in the distance, the faint hum of traffic, a distant reminder of the world outside. "I've been thinking," Ethan said, his voice low but full of purpose. "We've both been through so much. You've rebuilt your life, and I've watched you do it with such strength. I couldn't be prouder of you." Grace turned her gaze to him, her heart pounding. His words felt familiar, like the kind of things he had said to her before. But tonight, they felt different. Tonight, they held more weight, more meaning. She could feel the shift between them, a shift that had been building for months. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity she had never seen before. "I'm saying that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I don't want to keep waiting for the perfect moment. I don't want to wait any longer to build a future together. Grace, I love you, and I can't imagine my life without you in it." Grace felt her breath catch in her throat as the weight of his words settled over her. Ethan's confession wasn't just about his feelings. It was about everything they had been through together, everything they had built. It was about the trust, the vulnerability, and the undeniable bond that had grown between them. "I love you too," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've loved you for a while now. I didn't think it was possible. I didn't think someone like me could ever have a life like this." Ethan smiled, a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "You're more than capable, Grace. You've already proven it." The next few weeks were filled with new plans, new dreams, and a sense of peace that Grace had never known before. Ethan's proposal, though unexpected, had been the beginning of something they had both longed for. As they began to talk about their future, about the wedding, about the life they would build together, it became clear that their bond was unbreakable. Grace had always feared that her past would define her, that it would stand between her and the life she wanted. But now, with Ethan by her side, she understood that her past didn't define her. She did. And as they moved forward, hand in hand, the future suddenly felt like an endless possibility. The air was crisp with the first breath of autumn, and the streets of New York were bathed in the soft golden hues of the late afternoon sun. Grace stood in front of the apartment window, her fingers lightly tracing the glass, lost in thought. It had been a few months since she and Ethan had finally confessed their feelings for each other, since they had begun to build a life together, a life that, despite all odds, was growing stronger with each passing day. But today, something felt different. Something monumental was coming. Ethan had been acting a little differently lately. His usual calm demeanor had been tinged with excitement, and even though he kept insisting that everything was fine, Grace couldn't help but feel the anticipation that lingered between them. There was a restlessness in him, an energy that had shifted ever so slightly. And the truth was, she was nervous because she knew that whatever Ethan had planned for them, it was about to change everything. The door to the apartment opened, and Ethan stepped inside, his usual warmth filling the room as he shed his coat and hung it on the back of the chair. He smiled when he saw Grace standing by the window, a knowing glint in his eyes. "You're thinking again," he said, his voice light, but Grace could hear the underlying excitement. Grace turned around, trying to hide the nerves that threatened to show on her face. "What's going on, Ethan? You've been different lately." Ethan's smile widened, and for a moment his eyes softened as he walked toward her. He reached out, cupping her face gently in his hands. "I've been planning something," he said, his voice lowering. "Something I want you to be a part of." Grace's heart skipped a beat, but she tried to stay calm. "Planning? What is it?" Ethan took a step back, his eyes glimmering with emotion. "I want to build something bigger than just us. I want to build a life for us, a future that we can create together, something that will last. And I can't imagine doing it with anyone but you, Grace." Before she could respond, he dropped down to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Grace's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe it. It was happening. Here, in this apartment, the life they had fought for, built step by step, was now moving towards something even bigger. "Grace Miller," Ethan said, his voice steady, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I know it's only been a short time, but I've never been more sure of anything. Will you marry me?" The room seemed to spin as Grace's heart raced. She had always been afraid of this moment, the moment when someone might offer her everything she had ever wanted. She had never believed she deserved it. But here, with Ethan, everything felt different. He had stood by her through it all, through the doubts, the challenges, the judgments. And now, he was offering her something that had once felt unattainable. A future, a family, a life built on love and trust. Tears welled up in her eyes as she knelt beside him, pulling him into a tight embrace. "Yes, Ethan, yes, I will marry you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The weight of the moment pressed down on them both, but instead of feeling overwhelmed, Grace felt a sense of calm wash over her. This was the beginning of something beautiful, something they had both fought for. The next few weeks passed in a blur of excitement, planning, and the kind of joy Grace had never experienced before. Their wedding was small, intimate, exactly what they had both wanted. The ceremony was held in a quiet garden, the sun setting behind them as they exchanged vows, surrounded by close friends, family, and colleagues who had supported them along the way. The garden was adorned with soft white flowers, candles, and string lights, creating a magical atmosphere that felt like a dream. As Grace walked down the aisle toward Ethan, her heart swelled with happiness. She had never imagined a day like this, a day when she was not only embraced by the man she loved, but by the people who had seen her for who she truly was, not just her past. She was finally free. Ethan's eyes met hers as she reached the altar, and in that moment, everything else faded. It was just the two of them, standing together, ready to begin the next chapter of their lives. "I vow to love you, to support you, and to build a future with you," Ethan said, his voice strong, filled with the kind of sincerity that Grace had come to expect from him. "You are my heart, Grace, and I promise to always be by your side." Grace, her hands trembling with emotion, took a deep breath before speaking. "I vow to stand with you, to face whatever life throws at us, and to love you with everything I have. You've given me a life I never thought I deserved, and for that, I will be forever grateful." As they exchanged rings, Grace felt the weight of her past lift, replaced by a sense of peace and belonging. They were no longer just two people fighting for a future. They were a family, bound by love, by shared dreams, and by the belief that no matter what happened, they could face it together. The reception was a celebration of their journey, a beautiful culmination of everything they had built together. As they shared their first dance as husband and wife, the world around them seemed to disappear. It was just Ethan and Grace, spinning slowly under the twinkling lights, lost in the music and in each other. In the months that followed, they continued to grow, both as individuals and as a couple. Grace took on a more prominent role in the company, mentoring young professionals and working on initiatives that would help lift others up, just as she had been lifted. Ethan, always by her side, supported her every step of the way, and together, they made a real difference in the world. They were building something that would last far beyond their own lives, a legacy of love, kindness, and resilience. As the years went on, they faced challenges, as all couples do. But no matter what came their way, they stood by each other. They were partners in every sense of the word, always there to lift each other up, to encourage each other, and to remind each other that they were enough. One afternoon, as they sat together in their apartment, Grace glanced at Ethan, a smile spreading across her face. "Can you believe we've come this far?" she asked, her voice filled with wonder. Ethan looked at her, his eyes softening, as he reached out to take her hand. "I can't believe how far we've come," he said, "but I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. With you, Grace. Always." In that moment, Grace knew without a doubt that they had built a life together that was stronger than anything she had ever dreamed. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't always easy, but it was theirs. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed she deserved it. And so, as they stood on the threshold of their future, hand in hand, Grace knew that their journey was far from over. It was just the beginning of something new, together. As Grace and Ethan stand on the threshold of a new life, hand in hand, we can only imagine the adventures, challenges, and triumphs that await them. It's a story of love, growth, and overcoming the odds. But what happens next? How do they continue to navigate their shared future? And what new obstacles will they face? We want to hear from you. Do you think Ethan and Grace are ready for what's coming? What do you believe will be their next big challenge? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next chapter in this incredible story. Hit the bell to stay updated because we have more heartwarming, thrilling, and inspiring stories coming your way.